Accessibility is kind of a big deal for web design. It's the difference between a site that people can actually use and one that they can't. Of course, that same general principle applies to pretty much everything, not just websites. Accessibility is what lets people actually use, or access, your stuff. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't actually think about accessibility. Instead, they just design things that they can access, because that's totally good enough, right? For those of you playing along at home, that's some hardcore casual or internalized ableism right there. The internal assumption on the part of a non-disabled person that there is a normal level of ability, and that it's their own, and that everyone can, or should be able to, access whatever they can, because they're normal, so normal people should be able to do the same things that they can. Luckily, at some point in the design process, there will generally come a reminder that not only do people with different accessibility needs exist, there's often a legal obligation to make things accessible to them, which obviously makes everything work fine, because policies are definitely never biased at all. Thanks to the reminder, though, a few extra features get thrown on, and things are officially accessible. The problem with this is that while a building designed to just have stairs, that then has some wheelchair ramps slapped on later, is technically better than that same building without the ramps, neither option comes close to a building with ramps incorporated into the design from the word go. The same applies to websites. Adding on extra features is definitely better than just leaving things inaccessible, but it's still not as good as something designed to be accessible from the start. Of course, what makes it harder for designers is that there's no single solution for accessibility issues, mostly because it's not actually a single issue. There's any number of ways to be disabled, and everyone's accessibility needs are different. For instance, people with vision or print impairments. For people who flat out can't read what's on the screen, things need to be laid out so that screen readers can follow the text properly. Image descriptions, even super basic ones, are good too. For people with more minor impairments, it's good to have high contrast colors used for the text and the background, relatively large text, and maybe even a dyslexic-friendly font, like a Dyslexie. Deaf or hard of hearing people. Captions! The internet is full of videos and other audio with not nearly enough captions or transcripts to go with things. Neurodivergent people. This is a super broad topic and also very individual. The best way to make sites accessible for neurodivergent people is to pay attention to what we tell you we need and just do your best. What makes it harder is that NT peeps are obviously all individuals, and what works for one person might make it worse for another. Sensory issues, often related to neurodivergence, and still broad, but a little more straightforward. As a general rule, you should avoid things like autoplay and try to steer clear of busy pages. Anything with flashing lights, bright clashing colours, 5 million different fonts with every word a different colour. Basically just take MySpace as a guide to what not to do. Epilepsy. Pretty close to sensory issues for our purposes, since I'm mostly talking about seizures brought on by sensory overload or similar, so avoid the stuff I just mentioned. And if there's anything you absolutely must have on your site that might trigger a seizure, include a warning and make sure people can avoid it if they need to. There are more potential accessibility problems and solutions out there, obviously, but those are some of the highlights. Well, that's cool, you might say at this point, but how is it actually important for me? To which I say, really, hypothetical audience member? We just went over ableism, and now you're pulling out this. Not cool, audience member. Not cool at all. More seriously, everyone should have an equal opportunity to access whatever's on the web, or whatever isn't on the web. Equal access for everyone. It should be a thing. But if you want a more specific example, I will go to the floor for social media, for everyone, But there are two main reasons that it's super important that it's accessible for disabled and neurodivergent people. Firstly, community. Social media gives people who don't live near members of their community the opportunity to be part of it anyway. For some disabled and ND people, it's the only space where they can interact with people like them, which is why it's nice if they can actually use it, something that isn't always guaranteed. Secondly, easier human interaction. For a lot of ND people, whether they're autistic people, people with social anxiety, or anyone else, face-to-face social interaction can be really stressful and difficult. Social media allows for human interaction with far less stress. At least, it does if it's accessible. The problem with social media, though, is that it isn't always accessible. On top of the general potential issues, there's also site-specific problems and the possibility of problems with the content users post and how they post it. Take Tumblr, for instance. A lot of the obvious, basic issues are ones I've already mentioned. A lot of videos and audio posts without captions or transcripts, blogs with teeny tiny unreadable text, flashing GIFs all over the place, autoplay on blogs, which, seriously, even people without sensory issues hate autoplay. Why would you use it? And so on, with basically any other potential issue for online accessibility. Then there's Tumblr-specific issues. The main one is probably site updates. If you use Tumblr, this is probably where you're nodding along. For everyone else, Tumblr has a reputation with a lot of the user base for having the worst updates. Updates that do nothing, updates that just move things around for no reason, updates that make everything harder to use. What makes the latest update, as of the making of this video anyway, interesting is the mixed response, especially in terms of accessibility. Like I said, this isn't a monolithic issue, and what helps some people can hinder others. The main point of the update was to change how comments on reblogs look, going from this on the left to this on the right. For some people, it's a definite improvement when it comes to readability. For others, it's a huge step back. The biggest complaint, especially from people who have any kind of issues processing visual information, is that it makes the reblogs look like a string of unrelated comments, rather than a conversation, making it super hard to follow. There's also the fact that people can no longer edit comments before reblogging. So if there's a flashing or strobing GIF in the post, it can't be removed without losing all of the comments. Then there's the issues best summed up as, sometimes people using Tumblr are kind of horrible. The main example is probably inaccurate tagging. In theory, the tagging system should be great for anyone with psychological triggers. Blacklisting tags should let people avoid their triggers, or at least brace themselves to see them, so that they can avoid, say, massive panic attacks. Which, in case you hadn't guessed, kind of aren't great for continuing to access stuff. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes it's just a matter of people not thinking to tag things, which is still an issue, but not horrible. Other times, though, people deliberately mistag things. Tagging an image of gore with feminism, for example, which, on a practical level, screws things up for everyone, especially people who end up triggered by it, and is also just a majorly jerk move. However, despite all the accessibility issues, there's something else interesting and super rad about Tumblr, which is the user workarounds. Sort of the flip side of sometimes people using Tumblr are completely horrible. This is, sometimes people using Tumblr are really great. So some of these workarounds are just meant to make the site a little more usable for everyone, while others aim to help solve more specific accessibility issues, mostly for disabled and or neurodivergent people. The best known workaround is Xkit, an extension meant to improve Tumblr's usability. Mostly people use it to basically reverse updates. Before Xkit, an extension note called Missing E was supposed to do pretty much the same thing, and now that Xkit has stopped being updated, people have started the new Xkit in an eternal quest to keep the site as usable as possible. Beyond that, there's also a bunch of smaller extensions for a variety of smaller issues, ones that can be used on Tumblr or just online generally. Open Dyslexic, Readability, Hide GIFs, everything else on the screen right now, plus even more if you go looking. The great thing about these is that they're all individual. Like I said earlier, this isn't a monolithic issue where one set of rules will make everything accessible for everyone. Individuals all have different needs when it comes to accessibility, and being able to mix and match lots of little solutions makes it easier to meet those needs. As well as extensions, there are blogs devoted to helping with accessibility issues. Some of them are fairly general, full of links and suggestions for using Tumblr and making it more accessible, both for yourself and for others. Others try to help make specific content more accessible, like Captioned Vines, which replugs Vines and adds captions or a transcript, or Readable Posts, which edits posts to make them more readable. There's plenty of other workarounds that people have come up with out there, as well as other potential accessibility issues. But I think this is getting to the point where I need to wrap up. If you've stuck with me this long, there's just a few things I really want you to take away from this. 1. You can update things to improve accessibility, and you totally should, but it's always better if you try to make them accessible to start with as well. 2. There's plenty of ways for social media users to improve the accessibility of content, even if you can't do anything when it comes to the bigger site design issues. 3. Accessibility isn't a monolithic issue. Different people have different needs. 4. Accessibility is super important when it comes to social media, because it might be the only way people have to comfortably interact with their communities. 5. Finally, if you're not at least trying to make your stuff accessible, then you're excluding people. And as you may have learnt as a small child, excluding people is a jerk move. Don't be a jerk. Okay, so I kind of glossed over this, but as a final point, accessibility isn't just a thing for disabled people. We default to that specific part of accessibility in discussions because making things accessible for disabled people means doing things differently. But everyone needs things to be accessible in order for them to access them. Meaning that there's plenty of stuff that gets done so that things are accessible for non-disabled people. The reason we mostly don't think about that sort of stuff in terms of accessibility, though, is that non-disabled accessibility needs are completely normalized. Whereas the sort of things needed to make things accessible for disabled people are often seen as add-ons or accommodations that aren't strictly necessary. At the end of the day, though, the fact that text on websites tends to be written from left to right and top to bottom, that's about accessibility. We don't think about it that way because, well, normalized, like I said, but it is. Stuff could just as easily be written backwards and upside down, but it isn't. Because if it was, then people wouldn't be able to read it. Just like not having captions means that some people won't be able to access your content, or any of the other issues I talked about. Because accessibility is something that applies to everyone, but only disabled people have to fight for things to be accessible for them.